So I'm very much looking forward in particular to this morning's session, which is the role of eduGAIN in improving research. We want to get right into this because I can see this 2 hours going very quickly. So I'd like to introduce the moderator of the session. He's a very close and good friend of Eko-Konnect, and he's the person of Omar Owaya. He's the Chief Strategy Officer for the Western Central Research and Education Network, WACREN. He was the pioneer CTO of the regional REN and continues to work on the technical development of high-capacity inter-network infrastructure for research and education. Before WACREN, he was the CEO of DataSphere, a private sector consultancy offering software development and project management support to research and academic institutions in Nigeria and other parts of Africa. He leads LibSense, an initiative aimed at building the information management capability of librarians and researchers, fostering communities of practice, and strengthening the local services to support open science and research in Africa. He is a certified SIM3 auditor, and he takes keen interest in the establishment and maturity of security teams, or CSIRTs, in NRENs. So I'd like to welcome you, Omar, to this session and hand over control of this session to you.
Thank you, Owen. Good morning, everybody. It's a bit early in some parts, and so thank you for making it. So what I will do, this is more of a, we hope that this is more of a technical workshop than the other workshops, but even then it's largely informative. Now, one of the goals we are aiming at is to support NRENs in sort of establishing an identity federation here. As much as the role is, the title is eduGAIN, the role of eduGAIN in research, eduGAIN is the interfederation of identity federations. So we will have our speakers, one after the other, sort of setting the stage with an understanding, sharing an understanding of what eduGAIN is. And we would have some case studies from IDEM, it's Italian Identity Federation, describing their federation, the challenges they had, the successes, and how we can sort of learn from that. And then closer to home, we would have the South African Identity Federation, SAFIRE, and a discussion around that. So the hope is that this will be very interactive, that the audience will seek to answer a lot of the questions that they might have. I am well aware from the work we have done in eduID.Africa that there are gaps that we need to fill. So without further ado, I will introduce the speakers. They will speak, we will first set the stage and have an interactive session on that piece of information about eduGAIN. And then after that, we will have the presentations from the other speakers. So I will introduce everybody at the same time so you get a sense of who's in the room. So Mauro Real, our first speaker, got his PhD in high energy physics in 1997 from Wuppertal University. From then he got involved in grid projects, data grid and others, and started to work for the Italian NREN, GAR, in 2006. Within the grid projects, he had been coordinating the network support task, and amongst others, mainly for on the IPv6 compliance for grid middleware. He's also been involved in several projects, supporting the spawning of e-infrastructures and the adoption of identity federations in developing countries. Since 2015, he's been involved in ARC. ARC is a project, authentication and authorization project that was sponsored by the EU. And he's been working in tasks with dealing with pilots for guest identities. He joined GEANT in July 2019 and currently works there as the research engagement team, or works in the research engagement team to support user communities. Now, our second speaker is Davide Vaghetti from IDEM. He has a Master of Arts in History and a postgraduate specialization in telecommunication engineering. For almost 15 years, he worked as a system and network administrator in the NOC of the University of Pisa, and later became the head of network services. From 2016, he has worked in GAR as the digital identity and authentication and authorization specialist. And from 2018, he has led the IDEM GAR service as the head. Second part in quite a number of international collaborations such as ARC and GAIN, other GAIN projects, GAIN 4.2, GAIN 4.3. And since in 2019, he has had the role of eduGAIN service owner within the context of the GAIN 4.3 project. Our last speaker, Guy Hulse, is probably known to some. He's the executive officer for trust and identity at the South African NREN Tenet. This role actually spans the South African Identity Federation, SAFIRE, the EduRoam National Roaming Operator, and ORCID Consortium certification services, as well as DNS and DNSSEC operations. So he spent the early part of his career at the birthplace of South African Internet, Rhodes University, in different roles as a system administrator through to IT operations manager. He has a BSc in physics and an MSc in computer science. He has served on the board of South African Internet Service Providers Association and continues to participate in a number of industry user and steering groups. From the REN perspective, from the African REN perspective, Guy has also provided, capacity building support, to Ubuntu Alliance at different locations, and I'm glad that he's here today. So I think, we don't really need too much protocol in this. I'm looking and seeing that the numbers of attendees are growing. Hopefully we'll have much more as we go on. So Mario, can you take it on from here?
Of course, with pleasure. Thanks, Omo. Right, so I'm very glad to be invited to this panel today, and I'm glad to be with you guys again. What I will do is I will give a short introduction on eduGAIN and the benefits that eduGAIN is bringing to the community. So I'll share my screen. So let me know if this is okay. So if this is okay, I will start presenting. So, okay, so let's see if
you're going to present mode. Excellent. Yes.
All right. So as almost already mentioned, I'm currently working on in the research engagement team of Agent. And today I would like to give a short introduction on eduGAIN for those of you who are sort of new to the topic, and essentially present how successful eduGAIN has been in the last years. And then I will just mention shortly what are identity federation, which are the building blocks of eduGAIN after all, and their role. And I will zoom a bit on the working mechanisms of eduGAIN, and mention the supported research by eduGAIN and sketch some conclusions. So basically, eduGAIN is the history of a success, because of course you might have heard that, of course it's enabling actually worldwide classroom research, and it's constantly growing, and you see from this world map that we are really keen now to enroll countries in Africa, and you see from this eduGAIN coverage map that we really want to cover the whole world. That's the basic, that's the underlying idea that we have. And basically, what does it do? Well, in general, federated identities enable users to access services worldwide, right? Logging in at home, so at their home institution. That's the beauty of it. Basically, it improves access, improves security, and reduces the management of red cost of doing research and accessing online resources. I mean, we currently have 71 participants and more than 7,200 entities overall. So, and where were we 10 years ago? Well, 10 years ago, eduGAIN was a kind of a small pilot project, which started supported by GÉANT, based on SAM, as you might know, and that this map shows what was eduGAIN around 10 years ago. So it's undoubtful that it kept growing and it was a success in terms of idea. So what is eduGAIN about? eduGAIN provides an efficient, flexible way for participating federations and their users to interconnect, just to be able to use resources provided by the community of the research worldwide. It's of course trustworthy. It's trustworthy exchange of information related to identity and AI between member federations, and allows, of course, students and researchers to access worldwide of educational resources, which is available from the community. So the big picture around eduGAIN is actually an interfederation. So eduGAIN is in practice an interfederation service that connects identity federations around the world and simplifies content to services and resources, right? The thing that you see from this picture is that, of course, not all the resources of a federation need to be in eduGAIN, right? So it's, if you want, each federation has a subset of its resources that decides to make available to the eduGAIN community. And among these resources, there are mostly identity providers and service providers, of course. And now there's proxies and other entities, but the majority of the resources that are in eduGAIN are IDPs and SPs. So shortly about what identity federation are. They are a collection of organizations who decide to trust each other, right? They agree to interoperate under a certain rule set. And this rule set typically consists of legal frameworks, policies, and technical profiles, and standards to agree that have been agreed upon. An identity federation provides the required trust and security to exchange identities between home organizations and to access services within the federation. So basically, you see that institutions decide to collaborate and to mutually trust each other, and decide to enable each other's users to access services which would be normally accessible only to them. So it's all about trust, and federations are there to ensure that this trust is based on legal frameworks, policies, and profiles, and open standards and agreed standards. The most important standard we can think of when we talk about identity federation is SAML. And of course, SAML is an XML-based data format for exchanging authentication and authorization. It's a protocol, and in particular is there for safe exchange of information, authentication and authorization information between identity provider and service provider. SAM, the acronym stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. It's an OSI standard, and as I mentioned, is there mostly for communicating between IDPs and SPs. And as I mentioned already, its purpose is to enable authentication and secure exchange, trusted identity information between IDPs and SPs. It is the de facto standard for the identity federation. SAM is made of various building blocks. Profiles are the first building block of this standard. There's a set of different profiles which basically cover different use cases. The most important one, for the most common one and most relevant for identity federation is called web single sign-on, and that profile is basically how SAM achieves in practice, what kind of exchanges between entities and steps are there to achieve single sign-on. There's also other profiles, more complex one like the ECP, enhanced client to proxy. But basically the core profile for us is the web single sign-on one. So as I mentioned, an identity federation is a group of organizations running IDPs and SPs that agree on common standards. There's no limit to the size. The size can range from a local, even a few campuses federation, or a campus federation itself. It can be regional, national, and eduGAIN, of course, is worldwide, as you've seen. The IDPs and SPs, they basically read the metadata of a federation. And there's no limit potentially to the numbers of federation an organization could belong to. So what are the tasks carried out by federation? Well, at the minimum, federation maintain a list of which entities are there. So which are the identities to be trusted and the identities you can access and the services you can access through specific IDPs in your federation. So track the entity list, but most federations also define agreements, rules, and policy. I would say that's mandatory in the sense that this level of agreements, rules, and policy can grow if you want, but a minimal one is there for every federation, of course, as I mentioned. They provide some user support, documentation, lists, email list, mailing list, and then, of course, it's very common that federation provide a central discovery service. We will see that, but in practice is a way for a user to select his own identity provider while having to access the service. Some federation, on top of that, they provide an identity registry, which is, I would say, also very common, which is like a web GUI, which in practice gives you the option to register yourself, your IDP or your SP in a test federation before accessing the real federation. Some federation provide application support because the SP in practice is, for example, it's a tiny software layer that protects an application, but you need to interface application to SPs to make things working, and then some federation provide tools for managing guest user or develop custom tools for the community. About the rules span different domains. The technical, the legal domain are the most relevant one. Of course, about the technical, we say the supported protocols are probably the most important bit, but also the authentication mechanisms, the class of X59 certificate accepted, and the user attribute specifications. There are, of course, also rules about legal interoperability, so policies and requirements on identity management practices. I think for the benefit of time, I'll try to speed up a bit. So basically, there are two major kind of federation. In a full mesh federation, as you see from this picture, every entity talks to every other entity in the federation. So the model is a distributed model where IDPs and SPs are talking to each other. And there is, of course, the need to replicate the metadata of the whole organization, the whole chunk of metadata needs to be replicated everywhere because every entity needs to talk to everyone else. So basically you have to think of metadata as a lot of things, but also the public keys of the server you want to talk to. So there's no safe communication if you don't have available the public key of the server you want to talk to, the entity you want to talk to. That's why the metadata have to be distributed, and there's no need for a central component. as I mentioned, sometimes there is a central discovery service but there can be also embedded discovery service into the SPs. I would say it's common that there is a central discovery service, and all these entities are listed in a central metadata file, which is consumed by all entities. In an hub and spoke federation, things are different. Everyone talks to everyone else through a proxy, to a central element, which is called an IDP-SP proxy. This is less common as architecture. It has advantages and disadvantages with this to the previous one. But of course, here you don't need to replicate the metadata everywhere, but here you have a central single point of failure if you want. So the central proxy has to be highly available. And that's it's really important because, of course, if that element fails, the whole communication between the entities fails. So here you see that there is no need to replicate the metadata everywhere, right? So basically, everyone needs the metadata which are stored, basically the metadata that are stored on the hub. And on the hub, normally there is the central discovery service as well. This is one of the this is the standard flow, I would say, in Identity Federation and some. A user, there are other ones, of course, but this is to say the typical one. A user wants to access an SP. So basically the whole process is SP initiated. And the SP realizes protecting the resource and checks if there's an active session. If there's no active session between the user browser and itself, it points the user to redirects the user to the discovery service. In the discovery service, the user essentially sees listed his home organization, selects it, and once he selected that, he's redirected to his own IDP, to his home IDP. There he authenticates, an authentication assertion is then sent back to the SP, which basically allows the user to access the resource. So there's many other flows and many profiles, many bindings. It's not, let's say, a trivial thing. It's a complex protocol, very structured, but this is the typical use case, right? I mean, and this is web as so, centrally, completely, I would say. As I mentioned already, the participating entities register their metadata into the federation. A federation feed is built, so the federation validates and aggregates the entity's metadata, creating one or more feed. For example, typically federations create feeds for themselves, for their federation, and for eduGAIN. So basically, there's the subset of resources that are then registering to eduGAIN are this happens normally through a second feed, if you want to a parallel feed of the resources. And what is important, it's all about trust. So federation do sign and distribute the metadata. It's totally important that the metadata feed is, the federation's feed is signed, and it is then distributed through an MDS metadata distribution system. This is the way eduGAIN is working. So there is basically, these are the basic concepts and the basic mechanisms. So federations build a feed, and federation, of course, do sign their feed and make it available. Well, basically, eduGAIN mediates the exchange of the SAM metadata describing IDPs and SPs, and adds a bit of policy. That's, of course. So how does it work in practice? Well, I mean, there's an upstream feed that is built from the federation's feed, and I mean, of course, that is uploaded to fetch by the MDS system. The MDS system in practice also validates the metadata, checks the compliance to the eduGAIN profile, builds the eduGAIN feed, so basically the federation metadata aggregated and validated. And of course, eduGAIN itself acts as a federation if you want. So again, it signs the eduGAIN metadata feed. So this is the flow I mentioned. There's an upstream flows produced by federation and a downstream flows produced by eduGAIN. It is, of course, important that every entity in eduGAIN fetches the eduGAIN feed, or federations do fetch them and redistribute them. Who is benefiting from eduGAIN? Federation, service provider, identity providers. I mean, there's of course a boost in the number of resources that can be accessed by researchers. Federation operators are vital, are crucial. Trust is the basis for everything, for the whole process. And it is important that, as I mentioned already, that the federations are trusted and security measures are applied, and they are the key to the whole model. This we have seen, so it's still growing. There's a lot of information you can take a look at about attributes, about security, about tools and available tools around eduGAIN. I don't have time to describe them with detail. So take a look at technical.edugain.org. RefEds, it's a worldwide forum about federation. It does a lot of things, but also spawns specific working groups. It displays a metadata explorer toolkit, which is a way to explore the entities which are in eduGAIN. Libraries are there in eduGAIN. It's, I would say, all most popular and relevant key tools for libraries do support SAML and federated authentication. Easy Proxy is probably like a good example for those. All major online publishers are there. They provide access to federated credentials. You know, libraries used to use IP-based access, but I mean, now federated access is available. ORCID, you know, this unique identifier for researchers worldwide, is a registered service provider in eduGAIN. There's a large variety of learning tools which are available. Take a look on MET, for example, and you will see how many e-learning tools are made available through eduGAIN. And the community is still working in ways to further improve and provide easier discovery to the user through seamless access. So I'm closing now because time is running. Basically, the benefits are huge. As just 3 examples, I'll mention LIGO, IceCat, and the GAR Cloud. Well, LIGO, it's an international collaboration on gravitational waves detection, LIGO Virgo, and they are working to make their system compliant with it. Again, they already have a running pilot on them, and they further plan to include resources and provide access to eduGAIN. IceCat is a radio astronomy project using scattering techniques in the Nordic countries. They really moving from IP-based authentication for their catalogs to federated access. So again, the community is growing. The community which are endorsing federated access are a relevant number. As an example of YAS, for example, and GAR, the Italian RAN, is providing its cloud resources and through eduGAIN. So basically, you can register to the system through eduGAIN and get like a test project, and that has been achieved by federating the Keystone components. So I'm concluding now. The eduGAIN is a worldwide success story. I hope I managed to give you an idea about that and why. It's an open community, is welcoming new member federations. I'm sure Davide will mention that. and the research communities benefit from using eduGAIN. So that's undeniable. I mean, the number of access services increases significantly for them. Accessing publishers online, that's relevant for a lot of researchers worldwide. And the onboarding of communities is still in progress in this respect. So please take a look at technical.edugain.org for further technical information and refeds to have an idea what the community is doing at the world level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. That was a pretty nice and quick review. So I would like to sort of gauge sort of a reaction from the audience and understand that this had been communicated as clearly as I hoped. So are there any questions from the audience? And these questions can be of any sort. The intent of this session is because we talk about eduGAIN, and I know I can see in the audience that we have a mixed bunch. So I know different people, librarians might have, because we've talked about eduGAIN in the context of access to library content. We've talked about it, as you've demonstrated, Mario, in terms of access to research projects. So we might have questions from people who want to clarify anything. Are there any questions? Or maybe, our co-panelists can just add a little bit if there's anything. I just wanted to just get some interaction here before we moved on to the next presentation.
Yeah, feel free to ask anything. I mean,
Or maybe I should reverse the question now. And I'm going to ask the attendees. So is there anybody in the audience running an identity provider or a service provider or any of the components that Mario just presented? So it looks we have to warm it up a little bit more.
There are so I can see people from the Nigerian IDP in here. So yes, in answer to that question, there are some people here. I will name the institutions rather than the persons. Usmanu Danfodio University, Nnamdi Azikiwe University, and then also some of my team within Eko-Konnect. So there's certainly people here, but I think there is a question. Oh, no.
I can see somebody said no. Is there a question anywhere? None that I can see.
Well, Omo, we can always take questions.
Oh, that's fine. No, I just wanted to be certain that so that it's clear.
There's a hand up. There are two hands up. So, right. Ekene, do you want to ask your question?
Good morning. Yes, good morning.
Good morning, Ekene.
Yeah, my name is Ekene, from Nnamdi Azikiwe University. Okay, so I just wanted to ask a quick question. The eduGAIN, I believe it's based on Samero. So my question is, does the flow also work for mobile, mobile sign-on instead of just web only?
Okay, well, basically, the standard protocols for mobile application is more OpenID Connect, but basically there are proxies in eduGAIN which are capable of translating and token translation services which are there made available to proxies to be able to talk to OpenID Connect services. But in practice, if you're talking about accessing e-mobility, of course, as long as the web is supported, that's totally fine. I would say that basically, most of the web applications that and the web browsers now we have do support mobile access through the web. That's very important, but that is totally working already in eduGAIN. I don't know if the David or Guy want to add something, but yeah, mobility is supported in that respect.
So I can give a specific example. We have a service provider here who provides student discounts, and they have a mobile app, and they are doing verification via our federation, and they're doing that by launching an embedded browser in the mobile app to complete the authentication. So definitely it can be built into apps, certainly.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
so
I think that's sort of. Sorry, go on, Ekene.
Okay, that case scenario, if we can get access to, because we've been also working on some sign-on process both for mobile and for web in our own institute. So I would love to, if it's going to be possible for us to get the process for that mobile, I would appreciate it.
Ekene, what Guy was saying is that what Mario and Guy were saying is that yes, it is SAML, so it's web access, but in the case of the example Guy cited, the mobile application spins up a web server. Spins up web proxy so that you can access the mobile application can access via the web, access eduGAIN or your IDEM Federation via the web. So the idea would be that if you are developing on your mobile app, that you sort of provision it in such a way that the mobile app can connect over the web to your identity infrastructure. Did I understand you correctly, Guy?
You did, and in fact, now that I think about it, that's also exactly what the Zoom app does. If you enable SAML SSO on it as well, that's a very common paradigm.
Excellent. So so let's move on then. There's somebody else with a hand raised.
There was an Ngozi Osadebe.
Right. Okay. Ngozi, what's your question?
Yes.
What's your comment? She doesn't seem to be.
She has to unmute her mic.
Yeah.
Ngozi, you need to unmute your mic and speak.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Right.
Okay.
We can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I read from the slides that the identity providers and the service users have no work. I don't know if I'm right, that they do not know the federation.
Okay.
Are you getting me?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Can we go back to the first slide? I saw something that identity providers and service users do not interact or relate more. That is my own ways with the federation. So I'm wondering, how do the federations emerge?
No, okay, sorry.
Because I thought it is the users or the provider that we come together and say we want to federate, that sort of thing.
That's a good point and good question. I think that is a kind of unhappy sentence in the slide, if you are, but that was about to mean that basically they see the metadata, they see the federation through the metadata. That is the main point I wanted to underline. It's totally important that the metadata are available to each and every entity in a full mesh federation, but there is no other, I don't know how to say that, there is no other
engagement between them.
Yeah, there is no other binding besides, of course, the policy ones for entities to make use of federation. So basically, that was to me that what is totally irrelevant is that an entity is inside the federation metadata. The metadata is a file is signed and in good hands. So in a way that there is total trust and security applied at the federation level, so that people can actually trust it. Probably that sentence is a bit misleading. I agree with you.
Okay, I can understand that, but I'm still wondering. So how did they come into the federating units? How did they become a federation?
Oh, you basically registered your entity metadata to attest, normally to attest federation first. So basically, you upload the metadata that you generate once you deploy, for example, the Shibboleth IDP, and you often, I mean, probably Davide knows more about that. He's a federation operator himself. I mean, he's in the federation. But
yeah, in fact,
Davide, do you want to? And then I think Ngozi, by the way, Ngozi is a librarian, so I think your language should be adjusted accordingly.
yes, if I can add up a little bit to what Mario just said, yes, there is no direct engagement between an IDP and an SP, or a set of IDPs and a set of SPs in a federation. They know each other through a third party, that is the federation operator. So they both trust the federation operator, and this is why they can exchange metadata in a trusted environment. And how do they do that is through the registration process, as Mario was saying before, through which they register the entity in the federation, and they establish a trust relationship with the federation operator. So they don't need to establish trust relationships between each other. This is the ground foundation, I would say.
Thank you very much. I think it's very clear now. Okay, can I ask another question? Hello?
Yes, you can, Ngozi. Please go on.
Okay. Now, if libraries like us down here in Nigeria, in developing country, if we want to join this federation, how do we get the link or the address? Are we free, number one? And then how do we get the link to join?
So, Mario, I think you should make the point about eduGAIN being an interfederation, so that that's clear to her.
Yeah, I mean, let's say we're working, right, to spawn federations in Nigeria and to make them join eduGAIN. eduGAIN itself, it's an interfederation, and we are also working within Africa-Connect 3 to build a comprehensive catch-all federation for Africa. Basically, there are also options to register as guest users and guest IDPs in eduGAIN infrastructure. But we're getting there. I don't know, I mean, if your question was specifically about
So, because we have to move on, right, I will just sum this up. Ngozi, so the simple answer to this is that, you know, you will have to join a Nigerian federation, right? And part of this, the aim of this workshop is to support the emergence of that federation. There's already one that exists, eduid.ng, that's operated by Eko-Konnect. Now,
okay.
it is a pilot at this point in time. So this is also, we are bringing these our distinguished colleagues to come together to have more of a conversation and to establish a path, you know, for that federation to mature. So you right now, what you're expressing is a stakeholder's need. So I think we'll move on that. We'll move on that basis to Davide's presentation, where he talks about the Italian case, right? And then maybe you will get a deeper sense of how this works on a country basis. And subsequently, Guy would sort of introduce the South African perspective. And by the time we finish that, we should all know how this works. So Davide, please.
Yes, thank you, Omo. Let me share my screen. Hopefully this will work as intended. Do you see it full screen? Yes, great. So, hello everyone. I'm Davide Baghetti from GAR, which is the operator of the National Research and Educational Network in Italy, and is also the name of the network. So we usually refer to it as the GAR network. And I work for GAR, and I'm responsible for the IDEM Federation. I coordinate the IDEM GAR AAI service, which is, as I was saying before, the operator of the IDEM Federation. So what is the IDEM Federation? Well, first of all, is the National Identity Federation for Italy, that is comprehending the universities and research institutions to create a common ground for exchanging authentications, events, and share services. And GAR is the federation operator, and to do that job, GAR created this so-called GAR IDEM AI service. So we are a team of 4, and not everyone full time, to be honest. So we have someone that is helping with the secretariat, and people working on the support and the technology advancement of the federation, and me doing well, some technical work plus the coordination. So as I said, the goal of the service is to provide a common framework for the Italian education and research institutions for accessing online resources and reusing their institutional digital identity, which means basically the authentication system that they set up and the identification system that they set up and inside their organization to already authenticate users to access local services. So in order to reuse them in a federated environment, apart from the technology, you also need a trusted environment. And this is where us as the federation operator can have the role of the so-called trusted third party. And so as a federation and as the IDEM service, we adhere to specific standards for the federated identity, which are basically, as we already said, based on SAML 2.0. And we also support the work, and we participate to the work of REFEDS, which is the Research and Education Federation Operators Group, which is a worldwide forum where all the federation operators can usually work to advance the current standards and share best practices and solve common problems and face common issues. And then we also support eduGAIN, which on the other hand is an interfederation service, which means that it is the technology and the environment that we use to exchange metadata, and so to let our IDPs access SPs coming from shared and published to eduGAIN by other identity federations, as Mario just showed you. So what do we do? What is the role of and the federation operator? Well, first of all, we have to manage the metadata of all the entities that are part of our federation. So we need to collect, filter, and aggregate and sign the metadata. Signing the metadata is the way by which we assess that the entities metadata are well formed, and we apply our trust mark on those metadata, so that when another entity consume those metadata, they can verify the signature, and they know that those metadata has been vetted by the federation operator, by IDEM, and they can trust them. We also provide a highly available metadata distribution service, which in its simplest form is just an HTTP service, but obviously is a crucial part of how an identity federation works, because it is how we distribute the metadata. And then we do a lot of work for the organizations belonging to the GAIN community, which are, by the way, the ones that are eligible for participating to the federation. And we do a lot of training, and we provide documentation and the support to ensure resource interoperability, as we say here, but also to bring up all the technologies that are needed to participate to the Identity Federation, which for the members is usually an identity provider. And then we do provide a federation discovery service. This is common in most of the identity federations in eduGAIN and in REFEDS. And we do also other job, like managing the federation website and the entity registry. And then also we also do monitoring, auditing, and we manage the security alert for our constituency. So what are we speaking about? Basically, we have something like a little bit more than 200 entities in our Identity Federation. As you can see from these graphs, so we have this pattern of how can I say step-by-step growth. So we have periods in which we grow, and we have period of not steady growth, if you want. And we had, so far we had 3 periods like that. And the most interesting part for me, at least, is the IDP part, because that is where our constituency comes from, and then the services are mostly the service providers are mostly coming from commercial partners. But members are those that can publish an IDP, so they can authenticate users to the services for accessing the services. So these are our numbers, which are very compatible with the numbers of the entities that we have in our National Research and Educational Network. And something that is happening lately is that the growth of services is somehow masked by the fact that we import a lot of services from eduGAIN. So we do not register those services locally anymore. And this is true for many publishers, for example. But we do import them from the interfederation service. And this is very good, because we don't have to deal with them directly, but we can leverage the policies and the how can I say, registration process that has already been set up by other identity federations. So obviously, this means that we share a common ground with the other identity federations. So if I look back to how it all started, I can tell you what that it has been quite a long process, and it all started with a pilot in 2008. The pilot endured for 1 year, and then we started creating a production service. And in 2009, for example, we held our first convention about identity federation, and there was basically from bringing the local authentication systems to the federated environment. And what was crucial in that phase was the community building. That was the crucial part. It is still one of the most important factor, if I can say so. But in that phase, having some, having the ability to create a strong community made of some champions was really a crucial point. Without the community, we just, how can I say, a top-bottom operation or a top-bottom process, this could never have been done. And so I can't stress it more. The community is really crucial. So we had a second phase of growth for the Identity Federation, for IDEM, because in the very beginning, we had just a few services, mostly experimental services or services published by, registered by the members themselves. So the Identity Federation members themselves. We didn't have external partners that were registering commercial services. But then a key driver for the adoption and the growth of the IDEM Federation was the coming of the publishers, that they were more and more interested in the federation, because that was a really good way to offer access to the electronic academic journals without relying on IP-based access control, VPNs, and proxies. So the federated authentication was, a key functionality, because it let the researchers access the electronic journals from every place, and not just from the academic network. So that was really, really important. And it was the key for the growth, at least for those years from 2010 to 2014. And another phase was more about, at least for us, was more about a standard and technology update. And that happened from 2014 and 2018, and in that another, well, in that period, new architectures emerged, and for example, the ARC project, to which both me and Mario participated, was really important in that respect, because, for example, the things to which we are referring before, the Ekene question about how to support mobility in a SAML federated environment were explored in that phase, in the community, in the worldwide research community, and also the reflection of those exploration and exploitation and research projects were introduced in our identity federations as new architectures and proposals of new architectures. That's were basically based on proxies, bridges, token translation environment, but mixing and matching different protocols, like, for example, SAML, and Auth2 or SAML and OpenID-Connect. So, and with that said, this last phase, what is happening in the last 2 years, from my perspective and from the IDEM Identity Federation perspective, is that there is a new wave of research and students and that are in the need of new services published to the both National Identity Federation and the international services like eduGAIN. And so if I can say, if I would have to how can I say, use a tag for this last phase, I would call it the user phase, and because this is really what I'm seeing right now. So, and I'm speaking about the end user, not the organization, because there are now a lot of services that are that need to be consumed by final users, and so there is a lot of interest and new organizations that are joining the Identity Federation for that. For those services. One of the things that we that in the very beginning of the IDEM Identity Federation building process were looked for was a so-called killer application. That is, if you look also to other conventions and conferences related to the Identity Federation, this is quite common. I mean, looking for the key driver for the federated authentication adoption and the growth of the Identity Federation. So what can we use for as a killer application? That has been really the holy grail of the federated authentication. So as I was saying before, we had wikis and blogs and online learning environment. So we tried everything basically, and at some point came the publishers and the e-journals, and that was for sure a killer application. I wouldn't say that was the killer application, but sure was one of the key driver for the adoption. But to be honest, what I can say in terms of lesson learned is that the real killer application are the users. And their needs. So unless you have services that needs to be accessed by users, I mean, you don't need to look for anymore for killer applications. So their needs are the most important killer application for me. I know that I don't have much more time, so I would quickly go into showing you how is the federation governed. So, and what is the governance of our Identity Federation? We have a members assembly, which is composed by the IDEM Federation members, and that assembly had a board, used to have a board until 2 years ago. And that board was nominating a technical committee coordinator that was coordinating the technical committee. And that technical committee was working along with the IDEM service coordinator, which is now is me, to manage the federation. Well, to advance more than anything the federation. So at 2 years ago, we started a process to simplify a little bit that governance model because we had many bodies. Basically, the board was a little bit overloaded with not really overlapping with the technical committee. So we decided to create just one body, that is the technical committee, that is both acting as a technical body, but also as a representative body of the members' assembly. So this is the current governance model. We have the members' assembly, a president of the assembly, the committee coordinator, and that is working along with the IDEM service coordinator, and the technical committee to govern and advance the IDEM Federation. How does those bodies work? Basically, the members' assembly has 3 meetings each year. We try to have at least one in presence, obviously before the COVID, and so we are now heavily based on remote participation, and we also we also set up open working groups to advance the work. We have a technical committee that develop an yearly development plan, and that is working more or less as I was saying before, so I do not want to waste your time on that. Probably the most important thing is that the technical committee is responsible for managing these open working groups where the real work of advancement happens. These are the current working groups that we have in the IDEM Federation. And with that, sorry, I think I just consumed too much time. So, but with that, I'm finished.
Thank you, Davide. Oh, you have backup slides?
Yes, I also have backup slides, but that's enough, I would say.
No. So I think we'll just continue on this sort of information pitch with Guy's presentation, and at the end of that we can come back, and you might need your backup slides just in case. But let's hear from Guy.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, let me just get the sharing right. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. Okay, so I'm going to try and take a slightly different approach to this presentation to Davide, and I'm going to air a little bit of dirty laundry in this. I'm going to talk about the things we don't normally talk about. So I'll start by giving some historical perspective here. So the very early days of this, we have 3 organizations in South Africa, and in fact we have a fairly complicated national research and education network in that it consists of the 2 bodies on the left there, the SANREN competency area, which is largely government driven, and TENET ourselves, which is largely driven by the universities and the research community. So it's a top down and bottom up approach, and together we comprise what is in effect the South African National Research and Education Network. And we have this 3rd body called the SAUDIT, which is the Association of South African University Directors of Information Technology. And it's a body kind of formed largely on the model of CORDIT in Australia. And there's some power struggle that happens between these 3 entities from time to time, but they largely work together. And one of the things that they worked together on is that they realized in around about 2013 that Identity Federation was becoming a thing, and we needed to pay some attention to it. And so what they did is that they convened a meeting, and that meeting happened in February 2013 in Stellenbosch, and particularly importantly, they invited 2 international speakers from 2 federations to come and talk. They invited David Simonson from WAIF, the Danish Federation, and going back to what Mario said, they represented a hub and spoke federation, and they invited Heath Marks from the Australian Access Federation, who are a full mesh federation. And interestingly, they both had very different business models. So like we're doing today, there was some presentations and some discussions and that with the ultimate goal of trying to figure out what we needed to do to get a federation off the ground. And that meeting was jointly convened by all 3 of those organizations. What emerged out of that meeting was a whole bunch of working groups to look at various things, governance policy, things like that, the idea that we would build a technical pilot, and so on. Moving forward a little bit, we entered a period best characterized by a headless chicken. We had a lot of meetings. We had a lot of arguments about policy and branding and governance and ultimately about things that turned out to not matter. And we wasted quite a lot of time doing that. And in particular, I remember a 2-day meeting discussing what attributes our federation should support. And in that meeting, there was never any mention of the fact that eduGAIN had existing sets of attributes that were well understood. There was never any mention of the ReFed's research and scholarship attributes. There was a lot of argument about attributes. We spent 2 hours arguing about what the definition of given name was. We also spent a lot of time defining attributes that we've never ever used. And in fact, in a weird bit of irony, one of the attributes we spent a lot of time debating, I removed from our federation last year, having never released it to a single service provider. And so there was a lot of discussion, a lot of talk. There was a start at a technical pilot, but as a federation, we were largely headless. And that derives from the fact that there are 3 organizations driving this and nobody taking lead. It also derives from the fact that we were trying to establish consensus. Davide talked about community, and community is really important. What we were trying to do was get consensus within the 26 universities, or at least the 18 who were participating at the time. And consensus is really hard to get when people don't actually understand what they're trying to build. And so eventually what happened is in late 2015, 2 things happened. The first is that we, at one of these many meetings, there was a little side meeting that happened, and we established what we termed at the time the Coalition of the Willing. There were 8 universities who were willing to put some money on the table and fund a full-time post to start looking at this. And importantly, there was an agreement to appoint Tenet as a juristic person of record. So the problem was that we needed to be able to sign contracts, and you need a legal entity to do that. And when you have 3 heads, who's the legal entity? And so what happened was that Tenet took the lead role. And that was the point at which things started moving. And honestly, it could have been any of the 3 organizations. The important thing was that there was a clear definition of who was responsible and a clear willingness by a small number of institutions to actually put their money where their mouth was to move things forward. It happens that we never actually drew on that willingness to pay for things because Tenet managed to fund this out of its own operations. But having universities who were willing to actively move things forward created an environment where we could actually get a pilot really working, because we had people who were willing to commit their technical staff to actually being involved in that pilot and so on. And so, I mean, that was 2.5, nearly 3 years of time we effectively lost because we hadn't quite figured out how we were going to build this thing and didn't have a driving force. That also turns out to be quite significant in our current governance. So that diagram there shows how our current governance system works. We have a steering committee that consists of people elected by the members of our federation, and also people appointed by each of the 3 organizations that originally came together to form the federation. Underneath that, we have a participants forum, which is the equivalent of Davide's technical group. But the key thing is that this structure was originally designed to allow the federation to break off as a company in its own right, and for that steering committee to become a board of directors. And this really was informed by the Australian Access Federation's model, where they are a company independently of their National Research and Education Network, and they are probably the only federation that works like that. It turns out that the business case for establishing a federation as a company in its own right is really complicated and really hard, and even the Australians struggle with it. And the majority of federations kind of live within a National Research and Education Network where they enjoy some cross-subsidization. And so the reality is, we don't think that this splitting off that was originally envisioned will ever happen. That it's found a natural home within our research and education network, and that's led to quite a complicated governance structure that is a little bit heavier than needs be at the moment. So I want to talk about some of the things that we did right, and then I'm going to talk about some of the things we did wrong. And particularly from 2015 onwards, when we started to get some direction. One of the things we did right was start participating in refeds quite early, and in particular going to meetings. So as has already been mentioned, refeds is a loose organization of research federations around the world. It turns out that the federation community is really small and for the most part really welcoming and really happy to help, but it's hard to get into that community. That at least is our experience. And the meetings are a good way to, particularly when they happen face-to-face, to network, and that networking has been a huge thing in moving our federation forward. So there's a handful of names on there, and Davide's name is one of them. These are people who we've interacted with at meetings in a way that has had some impact on our federation moving forward. And it's not a complete list because that photo is really blurry and I couldn't find people in the photo when I was putting the slides together. And there are also people who are not there. But really, to emphasize that, getting in and participating in the community early is a key way to answer the questions that we should have answered in the first 2 years when we were running around without a head. If we'd been participating at that stage, we would have known that many of the attribute questions that we spent 2 days debating had answers. And we didn't need to spend 2 days debating them. And I can't get that time back. And so we've had a huge amount of support from that community. And I don't think we'd be where we were without the support of the other federations who've helped us along the way. One of the other things we did right was architecture. So Mario introduced the 2 architectures, the full mesh architecture and the hub and spoke. The hub and spoke turns out to be a relatively uncommon architecture, in part because of exactly as Mario suggested, there's some risk involved in it for the operator. It requires better availability and so on. And so we broke a trend by becoming the first new hub and spoke federation for quite a long time. And I don't think that there've been any new ones since. But we did this very, very deliberately. This was a very calculated decision. And it was really reflective of our understanding of our own community. We knew that there would be a shortage of SAML skills in our institutions. We knew that it was easier to centralize some of those skills in the NREN. That the NREN, although this introduced risks and required high availability, the NREN had a better capacity to manage that. And so the architecture was really driven around the fact that we knew we would struggle to onboard identity providers in a full mesh environment, because the learning curve to building an identity provider in that world was quite high. It also allowed us to take some of the workload away. So we have identity providers that would never be admitted into a full mesh federation that we can admit, because we do some of the heavy lifting for them. We can introduce attributes by default where they don't exist. We can clean up data along the way. The ability of having that central proxy has allowed us to onboard people we probably wouldn't have been able to onboard otherwise. The flip side of it is it does mean a lot more work for us as a federation relative to a full mesh federation. But the decision early on was to take that on board and to increase the staff capacity in the NREN to deal with that, because we thought that would make us able to push harder earlier. And I think that with some hindsight, I still believe that was the correct decision. Another thing that we tried to do was join eduGAIN very early on. And different federations have had different approaches to this, but it turns out in our case that joining eduGAIN fairly early on, before we had many identity providers, in fact, really as soon as we were in a position to do so, is a key driver, because if you look at that pie chart there, you'll see that's really representative over the year last year. Where authentications were happening, and you'll see the publishers are a huge part of what's happening. Now, we don't register those publishers directly in our federation. We get those publishers primarily through eduGAIN, and we piggyback on work done by other federations. And we have to shout out to the UK Access Federation here, because they do a huge amount of work with publishers, and we ride on their coattails. And that's been really important for us. But the other thing I kind of want to show there, Davide talked about killer applications. So MyUniDays is the big green block there. MyUniDays is a student verification service, and they happen to do Apple iTunes. And almost without fail, when we onboard a new identity provider, the very first login we see is an Apple iTunes verification by a student. It's not something we'd ever considered would be a big part of a federation, but it turns out that in terms of user demand, students are quite good at going to their universities going, why doesn't this work? And so we ummed and ahed for a long time, because we're supporting Apple in this, and should we be doing this? And if you look around, some of the other federations around the world are trying to commercialize the student verification stuff. For us, it's still a driver of behavior, and we think that that's quite important in building growth. And so we're kind of happy to support it for that reason. One of the other things I think we did mostly right, I have some regrets in this space, is libraries. When we started out back in 2013, we were talking about research. We were talking about building a federation to support research. Very early on, particularly after we joined eduGAIN, we had recognition that while research had been the primary driver, the libraries, the academic libraries in universities, were really strong allies in getting universities to actually join our federation. And this is because certainly in South Africa, the libraries hold a lot of power in universities. They hold a sizable chunk of the university's budget. They have directors in very powerful positions. They have people on the right committees. And in terms of getting institutional buy-in for committing resources to join a federation, libraries have been really strong allies of ours. We worked with a very small handful of academic libraries to make as many of the key publishers, the ones that were really important to South African institutions, working via eduGAIN to make it easy for libraries to get publishers to do federated authentication. That involves some pain for every publisher we have to get working, because we have to figure out their tribute release and their policy and so on. And so we have a few libraries now who are always willing to work with us to onboard new publishers. And that allows us to go to other institutions and say, look, we know these publishers already work because we have universities who are already using them. We attended quite a lot of library conferences, and we talked about federation at library conferences, and we worked with our local library licensing consortium to try and build federated authentication into their license agreements with publishers. And that kind of awareness work with the libraries has paid back huge dividends for us in trying to get institutions on board. Because if I talk to the research office and to the library in an institution about federated identity, the library director will be the one who gets my contract signed. And that might be a uniquely South African thing, but it certainly worked out for us. So Davide talked about killer applications, and our killer application really wasn't a single service provider, but if I had to name something, I would say getting the publishers working through eduGAIN has been what has driven our deployment of federation. That's not to say the research stuff isn't important. In fact, I'd argue it was equally important, but it represents a far smaller number of authentications through our federation and a much more fragmented community in terms of getting institutional buy-in. So the libraries get us our foot through the door, and the research follows it, and the researchers are very happy because the library has gone through the bureaucracy of an institution to get a paperwork signed and so on. So I think that's been very important for us. Things we did wrong: we tried to get consensus across 18 universities and 7 research councils. Yeah, no, I don't want to try and do that again. What we should have done, and the learning out of this, we should have identified early on lead institutions who were willing to be early adopters and to focus on them. You know, there are a lot of people who are very vocal about what they want, but when it comes to actually committing some staff to deploy an identity provider, they're non-existent. And if we'd figured that out earlier, and we'd worked with the small subset of universities who were willing to be early adopters, we would have got a lot further, a lot faster. Another thing we did wrong very early on this, we tried to work another country's policy. We took it happens the Australian Access Federation's policy, and we tried to rework it for a South African policy without really understanding that there are huge legislative differences between our countries. We have differences in circumstances, that they're a much more affluent country than we are. Their maturity of institutions is much higher than we are. And it happens that they'd built a different federation architecture to what we were trying to build. But also we didn't really understand federations. And so we were trying to build a policy without understanding what was really important in the policy. You know, with the benefit of hindsight, Refeds produced a policy template. It happened, it was very new when we were starting out, and we eventually figured out it was there, and that takes a lot of the work out, because it tells you the key stuff that you really need to pay attention to, that other federations care about, without getting boiled in legal verbiage and so on. And the other thing is to kind of really look at the stuff that matters for your country yourself. like take ideas from other people, but don't try and copy and paste text, because then your lawyers will throw it back at you, which is what happened to us. One of the things I have, I think, the most regrets about from a technology perspective, we wanted to build a hub and spoke federation, and we knew that, and I still think that's the right decision. What I think was the wrong decision was how we did it. We took a tool chain developed by and only used by one federation. It happens that it was WAIF, the Danish federation. And that was quite helpful because we got a lot of support from them at the very beginning. But taking something that's built by one federation ties you to their roadmap. And when our roadmap diverged from theirs, we got a little bit unstuck. And so with the benefit of hindsight, you know, I would stick to one of the widely used tool chains. I think that there's a reason why there's a small number of sets of tools that are widely used by many federations and have a lot of community support. So if I was to do this again, what I would do was take one of the ones that is actively developed by a large number of the federation operators and find a better fit like that, rather than having to end up, we've ended up having to put a lot of resources into maintaining a tool chain and relatively minor things in a tool chain. For instance, when SHA-1 to SHA-256 became an issue, we had to write the code for it. We couldn't leverage somebody else's code. And I've discovered the hard way that changing your tool chain is quite hard. You know, re-architecting processes that are running live authentication for people is not a small undertaking. If I'd known this at the beginning, I would have done things differently. So then the final thing that we kind of did a bit wrong was governance. We had this really complicated structure that was predicated on the idea that we might eventually spin this out as a company and so on. And that's left us with a structure where we struggle to get people to actually participate in our structures. We struggle to get the community involved. We have a steering committee that hasn't met in over a year, simply because we can't get people to schedule. And it turns out to be overly complicated and very different to how we run every other service as an NREN. And really what I would have preferred to have done is start with a much more streamlined governance structure, and that was easier for people to participate in, to get better participation in it, and to grow the complexity as it was needed, rather than to grow the complexity on the assumption that it might be needed. And to really, it would have helped us if we'd made this work the same way as the governance for other services that we operate, the IDEM Service and so on, because it would be easier for people to understand. Our governance structure is quite complicated to understand because we have a separate policy document for it. We have a separate, there are a whole lot of additional things you have to read once you've understood everything else. And I don't think that helps our case. Looking at where we are now and some of the challenges we have, one of the biggest challenges we have is institutional maturity. Like the concept of identity management is not well developed in South Africa. And having done a lot of work with some of the other African countries through the Internet Alliance, I think this is a general African trend. Identity management and the understanding of identity at an institutional level is generally quite poor. We, as I've no doubt other people have, still got people managing users on spreadsheets. And so that's a key challenge, because you want to introduce a quite complicated federated identity topic to somebody who doesn't understand identity to start with. When we do training, we tend to have to start with the basics of identity management within an institution before we can talk about federated identity, and that's not the experience I think many other countries have. Certainly speaking to other federations, they have a much more mature understanding of identity, particularly, for instance, in North America. A thing that's really driven in a large part by money is we have a very long tail of software. We have people who run really old, out of date software simply because they don't want to spend the money in changing it and upgrading it. This is old versions of Active Directories, of Windows Server. We have people running really old instances of Red Hat, and old versions of PHP, and they're fully aware that these things have security risks in them. But they're also aware that they don't have budget to replace them. And so that long tail of software has huge interoperability challenges, and it's one of the places where the hub is helping us, because the hub is hiding that away from people and allowing them not to expose those things quite so generally to the internet. Refeds conducts an annual survey about challenges facing federations, and the staff and skills one comes up every year across many federations, and it's not any different here. SAML is quite a niche skill set, and we struggle to find people who understand it. And then the very last point here is one I kind of recognize a lot. Keeping up. Like, the space is moving all the time. If I look at where things were when I started and where they are now, there have been a huge number of changes. There are things like the Certify framework that didn't exist when I started, that are new ideas. And so the amount of information that we have to consume and understand is growing all the time, and that makes it hard for new federations. It really does, because there's a lot more to it than there was when I was a new federation. But it also, we constantly have to keep up with what's going on. We have to pay attention to what the world around us is doing. Otherwise, we start to fall behind, and that's really something we don't want. So that's where I'm going to end it. That's kind of where we've come from and where we are right now. Yeah, happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Guy. I honestly cannot tell you how pleased I am that you sort of, open the drawer and shed your dirty linen, because that's precisely what I think we need. I liked Davide's presentation. It sort of put in that European context. It re-emphasized a bit about the governance structure, being lightweight, being the more efficient way to go. But I particularly like the fact that you have touched on things that I think resonate right across Africa. So for anybody who's been trying to do this, like in my case, maybe I tell a bit of my own experience. So in a number of European Union Horizon 2020 projects, we had tried the same approach, as based on the experiences of our European colleagues. So there was capacity building on how to set up an IDP, how to sort of manipulate metadata, but there wasn't enough capacity to build capacity, if you know what I mean. People didn't have the skills. You really had to go down to brass tacks at the beginning, so it was just efforts. So it didn't amount to much for 7 years. So we've been doing this since 2013 within the Regional Research Networks, Open Alliance as well. So about a few years ago, it's not to say our method is foolproof or that it solves all the problems. We started to look at it from a similar point of view. Maybe what we need to do is centralize some of this so we can get a core team managing this on everybody's behalf. Then we're hitting what you have it, that what you call the long tail of software. So identity and access management on campuses is not there. That's a nice, polite way to put it. It's not there, and it's the same case in the Nigerian situation. So I just took a few minutes. I know people will have your slides, but I'm thinking we're starting to sort of evolve what's important here. How do sort of resource-starved NRENs start a federation? So I think we can start taking some questions. I see some in the chat. Nobody seems to have used the Q&A, but I can see this is from Eko-Konnect, you know. Is it best to promote the adoption of the federation by piloting a service application in the community? If yes, how can one move these pilot users, institutions into members of the federation? And what ways would you recommend to help promote the adoption of an identity federation? So that's three questions in one, actually. So maybe what we just start is a discussion. The idea here is to see if we can promote the emergence of a Nigerian federation. So are there any questions? Well, these are Eko-Konnect questions. I think we should take them, but I'd like to hear from the attendees if there are any questions they have based on this presentation.
So while we're waiting for that, a comment on those questions. So the IETF have this idea of rough consensus and running code, and I think from my perspective, I think that's a good model for starting out. Like having a small number of people who are willing to participate in a pilot and have rough consensus of what that pilot should look like, and actually have running code. Have a working federation. There's nothing that drives federation adoption more than a working federation. Like it's nice showing what you can do. It's much easier demonstrating it actually working.
I fully agree there. Owen.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. Guy, you know, you talk about having 17 institutions and a number of research institutes, and that was challenging. And in the Nigerian scenario, we have hundreds of institutions, and with capacity, which I think is a whole lot less than what you have in South Africa. So this idea of really consolidating around a few forward or pilot championing institutions and identifying personnel within those institutions to really drive a pilot, I think makes a lot of sense, because even in our own experience, you know, we've been getting a lot of help from WACRA and from OMO. But even as we try to build the federations, we see that there are only like 2 or 3 that are really engaged and serious about trying to build their federations. And so maybe we should look at a focus to consolidate with those institutions and users, and then see have a properly working federation that maybe other institutions would then quickly buy into. I mean, your presentation is very thought-provoking, Guy. So it's given me a lot to think about. But I'd be really interested in hearing what other participants here have to say.
There's a question from Nkiru, but I was going to ask Davide. So I saw four roles. Those are the only 4 people that manage your federation. And what about this? So in terms of technical skills, how much in who is that sort of imbued? Who runs this from a technical point of view? I want to see what the commonalities are. Clearly, as Owen said, you know, we speak Guy's language, so to speak, you know, so we understand those issues, and we sort of can identify with them. Yeah. But I was thinking in your context, yours is a mesh federation, correct?
Yes, it's a full mesh federation, and So in terms of, yeah, it's all those 4 people that are doing all the stuff basically, and so well, in our case, the choice of a full mesh federation was probably more than anything related to the fact that the universities and the members of this federation would really like to maintain their own autonomous system and be more independent from you know, from the centralized, from the federation operator. This is basically the thing, the most important thing. So we, and because, and I think this is common also to other places like, for example, France and Germany. Basically, those are the 2 probably most similar model when it comes to identity federation, similar to Italy. UKF is also similar, but it is also a case by itself because it has a slightly different approach in the registration of the entities. But yeah, more than anything, the willingness to maintain their own autonomous systems was the driver for the adoption of the full mesh federation model. As when it comes to building the skill set to run an identity federation, that took quite a long time, and it is an ongoing process. As Guy was saying before, we are struggling to keep it up, and with the new standards, and there is a lot that is adding up. There is also, to be honest, there is also, what can I say, something that is good for latecomers. So you can find a lot of stuff that are ready to run. When we started, a lot of things were still not so sophisticated and not something that you could pick up from the shelf, right? So now what you can find is, for example, pipelines or Docker instances of a metadata data distribution service. The software itself is more mature. So there are things that are good also for latecomers, as usual, right? Italy has a long history of being latecomers in a lot of fields, for example, like internet connectivity. Now we are ahead of many other countries when it comes to fiber optics and in the city, in the towns. But that also it is because we didn't develop a cable system. So and we didn't have a lot of money put in the cable system, in the internet based on cable system before. So we had money to put on fiber optics later. So there is something that is good for latecomers. There is also another question that I see in the chat that is about the funding approach, and I would like to spend really few words on that. So in the case of GAR, of the Italian National Research and Education Network, we don't ask for a fee for the IDEM Federation. Obviously, there is a cost. There are resources allocated, people that are working their hours on that, but we don't ask money because our funding model is based on paying for the connectivity. So basically, each university and research institution, they already pay for the connectivity, and then there are a bundle of services that are related to the GAR offer, and that are paid with that money. This is our funding model. There is a big limit in this funding model. You have to be eligible to be connected to the GAR network, to the National Research and Education Network. So, and now we are facing some issues with this model, but this is what it is in this at this time.
So I can talk about our funding model.
Yeah, please, Guy, before questions.
So the first thing is to realize that there are identity providers and service providers. And there are very few federations that have successful models that involve charging service providers. And in fact, eduGAIN breaks that substantively because the service providers will just go and register somewhere else. So we very early on took the decision that we were never going to charge service providers. It's not in our federation's interest to try and get money out of service providers. The identity providers are really where we've got to derive our income from. Like Davide, we bundle NREN services with connectivity, and federation membership is in that bundle. But we have a pricing structure for it. We have worked out the cost of it, and there is an option to join the federation as a member of the federation and pay for just that outside of that bundle. So you get it if you take on the full bundle of NREN services as a value add, but it is possible to buy only that service from us. And we have a general approach going forward that we want to do that for all services, that we want every service to be costed so that it could be purchased individually, but the bundle will always cost you less. We have one identity provider who is not otherwise a participant in the NREN and pays exclusively for being part of the federation. The remaining 17, 18 are all getting it as part of a bundle.
Thank you. So yeah, that whole bundling and pricing and NREN legacy models are starting to sort of unravel, you know, when we even within like the regional, because we sort of did exactly the same. You bundle everything into connectivity, but then you are limited by the rate at which you connect people, or you can offer connectivity to people. So yes, we're also thinking about that. And before I take your comment, there is this one from Nkiru Emezia in the Q&A, and she says, in Nigeria, librarians are often stifled by top administrators when it comes to presenting new ideas to help research. Secondly, the budgetary allocation to libraries is often tampered with this, making it difficult for academic libraries to get what they actually want. How can this be overcome? It's not directly related to eduGAIN, but you know, I think maybe you guys can sort of put a spin on that so that you can see how we can help the libraries within their context with identity federations, or how they could sell it, or you know, put it before management, or contribute to that consciousness that management needs to have within the campuses. And that's an open to anybody.
So I can comment a little bit on this. One of the things that turns out to be really important to libraries here is stats. They want to know if particularly because in the context of a South African university's budget, the international publishers, international resources are really expensive. The exchange rate doesn't help, and so on. And so there is a question of value for money, and the value for money is demonstrated by statistics. So being able to start tracking logins to library services, who is using it and why, turns out to be a useful thing for our libraries to be able to justify the money that they're spending on those resources. And so that's something we're acutely aware of. We are not producing enough reporting for our libraries, and we would like to produce more.
Yeah, I can. I have to say that the guy has a point, and this also has been one of the argument that we used also for some Italian universities, for example, as a leverage for introducing the federated authentication, because with the authentication, well, for example, with IP-based access to e-journals, you can't tell which department and which faculty is using that resource. So when it comes to charging internally in the university, for example, that specific department or that faculty for, as Guy was saying, usually pricey contracts for accessing academic journals, you don't know who to charge more. For example, who is using the resources? With federated authentication, you can answer that question. So this is an argument that librarians can use with the top management. Do you want to know who is using the resources in our university, in our research institution? The federated authentication is the answer.
That's a nice one. I see, and this is not from Nigeria, but I see Nina Chachu, who is the executive secretary of the Library Association in Ghana, and Irina Kuchma from IFUL in the participant list. So I'm aware of a pilot that's going on in Ghana with the Library Association in terms of leveraging Identity Federation to sort of do exactly what you're talking about, Davide and Guy. First of all, to take advantage of the UK Access's nice work in eduGAIN by joining eduGAIN to access those publishers and to itemize this. So I was wondering, do either of them want to say anything or contribute to this? So I think.
While they're deciding on that, Omo, I just have a very quick, just a curious question to Davide. When you were presenting your slides on the growth of registered SPs and IDPs, we saw this tail off of dismissed IDPs and SPs. What were the causes for that?
Well, in the case of IDPs, basically I can say that it is usually the exchange of technologies. So we have dismissed IDPs, not really because we had any members leaving the Identity Federation. That didn't happen. So it's just a normal exchange of technology. In the case of SPs, it is completely different. So it is effectively services leaving the federations for, I would say, basically because most of them were either experimental services or services that were ceased to be useful and were not used by anyone, so they were dismissed. So in the case of dismissed IDPs, those were just old platforms exchanged for new one. In the case of SPs, were usually services not used anymore or experimental services that just died.
Okay.
I see Irina is on. Can you unmute yourself? Yes.
Yes, thanks so much. What I'd like to add is that we saw a benefit of libraries collaborating with NRAN Garnet in Ghana to enable access to e-resources off campus. And we also see a benefit of this coordinated approach where library consortium collaborates with NRAN and supports universities making sure that they could be part of National IDEM Federation and also enable access to e-resources. And if some of you are interested, we'll be happy to share experiences. So we're still in the beginning of a journey, but we'll be happy to share. Thanks.
Excellent. So we are running out of time. We're about to finish. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, right? Now, so we have Eko-Konnect, right? And some other NRANs in a similar situation. We have learned about the different options. We know it is important to join eduGAIN. Thanks, Guy. We want to do that early enough so that we can learn from your experiences. So I want each of you to say, so it's a piece of advice for the end. if they were going to take the next steps, right? If you can just sort of wrap that up in 1 minute, key things they should do now to move on. Mario, you start.
Well, I actually would recommend you to get in touch the more you can and talk to each other and try to focus on the commonalities that are there. You mentioned a lot of institutions in Nigeria, so I think you have a lot of opportunities to leverage this amount of users and to benefit from services. So I would say share as much as you can and discuss internally what are the next practical things you could do. Try to identify people, because the people and skills are key here. People you can invest upon, keep hammering on learning and training. And of course, my last recommendation is try to identify a driving organization who could really boost this for everyone and build consensus.
Thank you, Mario. Davide?
I don't think I have anything that is very different from what Mario said. So concentrating on the community or a set of forerunners, the people and a few set of motivated and organizations that could open the way for the others. This is the important thing. You can't expect to to build something complex and wide in just a first attempt. So I would start small and grow step by step. This is my advice.
Thank you. And Guy, now you already have insights into most of the African NREN situation. So
I completely agree with what Davide says. Start small and grow from there. But I have another take on it, which is I think it's key that Africa starts participating in the broader community, because what's happening right now is the standards that we are using evolve, and we are not participating in their evolution. And that ultimately means that we play catch up and we have to implement a standard that somebody else decided on our behalf if we want to play in this global federation space. And so I think that participating in the community, not just the community within the country, but the broader federation community early is important for two reasons. One is it exposes you to that work that's happening and allows us to have more African voices in that work. And the other is that the community is really willing to help, but you have to be there and ask for help. And if you're not participating, nobody knows who you are, and nobody knows what you're trying to do, and nobody knows what your challenges are. So that's my take.
Well, thank you very much. I have nothing to add to that. Well, maybe a bit, but what I took away from this, and I'm just going to rehash some of what you guys said, because I thought it was really important moving on. And this is, and within the context of the work we're doing in Eko-Konnect 3, this has been a very this is excellent input into that work, because I've always been concerned about sometimes the suitability of our approach, considering the environment we wanted to work in. So I'm taking some things away. For the governance, we need lightweight governance. In addition to what you guys said about starting small, whatever it is, we need to solve that small, because there's a tendency sometimes in African organizations to start with governance issues before they actually sort of start operations, so running code, so to speak. So get the running code there. If you need governance, it has to be lightweight. And it can get complex if you want later, if there's a need for it. Architecture, it's great to sort of adopt what most people have done, but then it needs to take your own context into consideration. So if you don't have the skills or the skill set within the organization to sort of grow, I'm taking the South African example, then you need to sort of consider that when you're deciding on architecture. And I looked at the rest, the issues that you have in the country, we should look at ways in which we sort of address them. So if you know you're going to be you're going to be sort of creating a federation where campuses don't have the basic identity access management in place, then you must think about that and how it affects the growth of your federation. Other than that, I think this was an excellent 2 hours spent. I'm looking forward to continue the conversation. From what you guys have said, I suppose one of the things Eko-Konnect in Nigeria should be looking at is, well, sort of defining a roadmap that includes all these issues, and more importantly, see how they join eduGAIN as soon as possible so that they can leverage the benefits the way the South African Federation did. On that note, I would thank you all for making the time. We are 4 minutes past the hour. And thank you all again. Owen, is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion?
Thanks, I think you've kind of said it all as it pertains to this session. Just to thank you and the other panelists, Guy, Davide, and Mario, for their contributions. It was very, very, very useful. And to thank also all the attendees, and to just let them know as well that the upcoming session in an hour's time, just remind you, the innovation and entrepreneurship for digital transformation in education starts in less than an hour's time. So thank you everyone for your time and your data, for those in Nigeria, for being here.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks everyone.
Bye everyone. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.